what seems to be happening to me is that not only do they get all the gold, but they get all the bloody unearned moral virtue, because now they have the gold and they think, well, I'm going to atone for my sins by what? By standing forward for equity now that I've made a fortune, and by what? Trying to save the planet by decarbonizing it, despite the fact that my industries, at least in principle, by my own standards, contributed to that?
It's not even their money.
Mm-hmm.
It's the money of everyday citizens in that democratic society, which has been aggregated in the hands of these small institutions, that are using the money of other people to advance social and political agendas through the market that most of the owners of capital actually disagree with. So in a certain sense, there's a large-scale breach of trust here.
Welcome to episode 160 of my podcast. I'm Mikhaila Peterson. I had my dad, Jordan Peterson, and Vivek Ramaswamy on for this episode. I heard about Vivek through a mutual friend because of his book, Woke Inc., where he talked about ESGs. He's on today to discuss ESGs and his new book, which is out now, linked in show notes, called Nation of Victims. ESGs are something that everyone should know about. When I was opening for Dad's shows, I was actually talking about them because I think it's one of the most important topics that people should be discussing now. It's an acronym that discusses how people who have control over companies like Blackrock are influencing policies that are contributing to issues like massive energy shortages. This is really serious. We trust companies to do what's in a company's best interest. You can trust that the CEO of a corporation is going to be greedy to make his company worth more. That's at least trustworthy. What you can't trust are CEOs who are not elected, banding together, deciding they know what direction society needs to take, then influencing how companies operate in order to push society in that direction. And the worst part is most people don't know this is happening or what the outcomes are. This kind of setup is not how America was built. It's not even capitalism, really. So I wanted Dad on in this episode, and I didn't do much talking, really. It was mostly listening and learning. Vivek's a former technology and biotech entrepreneur, and his most recent venture is an asset management company that's very interesting called Strive. Vivek founded Strive to promote excellence capitalism, which he hopes will offer a better alternative to the popular and very destructive ESG model of asset management, which, like I said, is deeply and largely responsible for Europe's growing energy crisis. In this episode, we discussed and defined what ESG is. We discussed the asset management company BlackRock and its founder, Larry Fink, the revival of civic duty in the West, the dangers of too much centralization, optimal resistance, the invitation to play, and much more. Before we jump into this episode of the podcast is sponsored by Rabbit Air. Each year since 2009, Inc. magazine has consistently rated Rabbit Air as one of the fastest growing companies in the U.S., for a good reason. They make air purifiers, actually, right here. It's usually snuck off to the side. Look at it glow. Is it gonna focus back there? There's my beautiful couch too. Anyway, there it is back there. They make air purifiers, which is something I've used since I was a kid, but they were always clunky and loud and made me feel like a dork. I've always had trouble with allergies, which is you guys probably already know, but my tree allergies are so insane that recently I had to move from Tennessee to Florida so I could breathe and function normally again. I had bronchitis off and on for 6 months, which was awful. I would have suffered a lot more, honestly, if it wasn't for the air purifiers I had around my house from Rabbit Air. Their latest innovation, the A3 Ultra Quiet Air Purifier, won the IFIDEA Good Design and the world's most prestigious Red Dot Design Award, thanks to the stylish design and the advanced filtration technology that targets airborne allergens, particles, and odors effectively. We breathe in almost 2,000 gallons of air a day, and most Americans spend their days inside. It's a lot of potential mold, tree pollen, and dust that you're breathing in, especially if you have pets or live in Tennessee. If you wake up congested, or you have kids that wake up with a stuffy nose, or if you just want to sleep better, I would recommend going to rabbitair.com today to see their models or call them 24/7 to speak to a Rabbit Air consultant. That's rabbitair.com. They're the brand I use, and I'm super picky about brands I use and about health. I hope you enjoy this episode. Vivek Ramaswamy and Dad, Jordan Peterson. Welcome to my podcast.
It's good to be on.
Looking forward to it.
Vivek, before we get started, can you give a brief background about who you are and what it is you do?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio, not far from home in Columbus, Ohio, where I am today. I began my career as an entrepreneur. I had studied molecular biology in undergrad at Harvard. I thought I was going to be a scientist on an academic track. I ended up getting into the world of biotech investing at a hedge fund from 2007 to 2014, where I co-managed a biotech portfolio. Spent 3 of those years in law school at Yale. Thought I was going to be interested in law and political philosophy, scratching an itch that I had as a longtime scientist. I ended up leaving my career as an investor, though, in 2014 to start a biotech company called Roivant, which I built as CEO for 7 years. We developed a number of medicines. 5 of them are FDA-approved products today. But I stepped down from my career as a biotech CEO, and I thought I was done with my business career when I stepped down to write a pair of books, Woke Inc. and Nation of Victims, the most recent one. And I've been writing in the Wall Street Journal, producing scholarship on issues relating to stakeholder capitalism and the ESG movement. I thought that was going to be my future in writing and possibly, dare I say, thought leadership in this particular area that was a passion of mine. But I was called back to the world of entrepreneurship in part by my own writing. Highlighting a problem was somewhat important, but I thought that addressing the problem was even more important. And that led me to start the latest company that I'm now leading, which is Strive. And it's a new asset management firm that's competing against companies like Blackrock and other leaders in the so-called ESG and stakeholder capitalism movement. And so that's made this a very busy year with a new book and a new company, and hopefully reviving what I think of as excellence in our economy and our culture in the process.
Okay, that was fantastic. I think before we get into this conversation, you should describe to people who don't know exactly what ESG stands for and what it means for people.
Yeah, that's a good table stakes point, because the definition keeps changing even by its biggest proponents. So I think it's important we flash freeze it so we can talk about it, whether or not we agree. Yeah, ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance factors influencing the allocation of capital in global capital markets. Okay, that's a mouthful. Well, that's a close cousin of a broader movement called stakeholder capitalism, which refers to the basic idea that businesses should not just focus on selling products and services for a profit, but that they should also advance other social agendas and societal interests. That sounds benign enough. Now, this was designed as a contrast to the worldview advanced by Milton Friedman in the 1970s and 1980s, where he said, no, the right purpose of a business is exclusively to focus on selling products and services for profit to maximize value for shareholders. Mm-hmm. And the thing that Milton Friedman worried about was that if companies didn't do that, they'd be less effective at making widgets, and the size of the economy would shrink and everyone would lose out. As you know, we can get into this, but my critique of this trend is actually quite different than Milton Friedman's. My main concern is not just that it threatens the effectiveness of American capitalism or the effectiveness of corporations, though I believe all that's true. My bigger concern is that the ESG movement and this broader philosophy of stakeholder capitalism actually threatens democracy, because democracy is a system built on the idea that everyone's voice and vote counts equally on questions ranging from climate change to addressing racial injustice. Whatever the right answers may be, those are the political questions that a democracy settles through free speech and open debate in the public square. And it's my view that what the ESG movement demands and what the stakeholder capitalist movement demands is that actually we take those questions out of the political process and settle them through the use of capital force in boardrooms across America and across the West more broadly. And I think that's a betrayal of the democratic system that we built in 1776 in this side of the ocean. But even more broadly, a betrayal of a system of self-governance of free agents in a free society.
Let me ask you, if you don't mind, a couple of questions pertaining to ESG. 3, I would say. It isn't obvious that if the focus of return switches to the stakeholders, let's say, the broader stakeholders, that doesn't mean something like, I have a particular ideological agenda and it's the moral one, and because of that, you should subordinate your company to me, rather than say, dedicating it towards these hypothetical social agenda and interests. So the first question might be just exactly what are those hypothetical broader social interests and who determines what they are? And then on the Friedman side, I've always been curious about this because Friedman's notion was that a company should maximize shareholder value. And my issue with that as a research psychologist was always, well, maximize shareholder value over what time period? Because if it's quarterly returns, that looks a hell of a lot different than if it's a pension fund and it's a 20-year investment horizon. And that's very much relevant to the issue, let's say, of the sustainability that the ESG power mongers hypothetically are working to promote. So the first question is, what are these social agendas and interests? And why is it that some arbitrary third party, let's say, should be able to set what those are? I know that your concerns pertain to that to some degree.
Oh, to a large degree, actually. So you're getting right to the heart of the most important questions here, which is great. I mean, look, I think that the questions that are the prime targets of the ESG movement today generally relate to staving off global climate change and delivering equity to rectify what they view as historical group identity-based injustices, racial and gender-based and sexual orientation-based. Those are, when you think about the E and the S, the environmental and the social prong, which are really doing most of the work here, the G is just a nice little add-on at the end. It's really mostly related to staving off global climate change through decarbonization and achieving global equity, both between different identity-driven groups based on race or gender or sexual orientation, and also even transnational equity, which actually relates to the first agenda of staving off global climate change. So those two things work in concert. But the question is, who gets to decide? And I think that's actually the biggest and most mysterious question of all. It turns out that the answer to that question is one of the principles that I have revived in my first book, which is the principle of the golden rule, not the golden rule that most people know, that you treat people like you want to be treated in return. No, the golden rule that says that he who has the gold makes the rules, which is to say that the people who control the largest swaths of capital are the ones who make the unilateral decisions as to which questions they prioritize.
Hypothetically, that would be fine if the rules they were making pertain to their capital. But what seems to be happening to me is that not only do they get all the gold, but they get all the bloody unearned moral virtue, because now they have the gold and they think, well, I'm going to atone for my sins by what? By standing forward for equity now that I've made a fortune, and by what? Trying to save the planet by decarbonizing it, despite the fact that my industries, at least in principle, by my own standards, contributed to that.
So much to say there. I think first, though, we have to pause on whose gold they're actually holding. So this is different than the John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie era, where it was their own gold and they would wield it to advance not only market power, but certain forms of political power. And that's one debate. And we can get to that debate. My biggest beef is actually even simpler than that. What's happened in the 21st century is that, for example, let's just take the three largest asset managers in the United States, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. Those three institutions wield not tens of billions or even hundreds of billions of dollars, or even trillions of dollars, but tens of trillions of dollars. $21 trillion just in the hands of those three institutions. Half of that, 21 trillion almost, in the hands of one. Yet, here's the rub. It's not even their money. Mm-hmm. It's the money of everyday citizens in that democratic society who has been aggregated by the hands of it, which has been aggregated in the hands of these small institutions that are using the money of other people to advance social and political agendas through the market that most of the owners of capital actually disagree with. So in a certain sense, there's a large-scale breach of trust here. Even if you accepted that the guys who have the gold get to make the rules if it's their own gold, that's a proposition we can itself debate. The funny part here is it's not even their gold. So that's the betrayal at the heart of the modern ESG system. And you ask the question of who gets to decide? The answer is it's a small handful of actors, people like Larry Fink, the CEO of Blackrock. And is Larry Fink worth $1 billion or whatever? Sure he is, but he's not worth $21 trillion. He's using $21 trillion or $10 trillion in BlackRock's case of other people's money, most of whom don't even know that he's doing it, and most of whom don't even know that he's using it to advance social and political agendas that most of those people disagree with. Now let's get to the deeper question that you raised, though, is, look, if you earned a lot of money or aggregated a lot of market power, presumably it was by market judgments that give you standing to decide which products rise to the top, whether this jacket or a different jacket or this phone or a different phone rise to the top, that's not a one person, one vote system. And I don't think it should be. That's a $1, one vote system. But if you're talking about how to settle, how and whether to address global climate change through higher prices for goods versus lower carbon emissions, or racial equity through quota systems or some other means, those are not the kinds of questions that one ought to settle through the use of capital force, because there's no greater standing for Larry Fink or anyone else to have a superior view as a citizen on the answer to that question. Those are the kinds of questions where everyone's voice and vote ought to, in my opinion, count equally, regardless of the number of dollars they wield in the marketplace, unadjusted by the number of dollars they control. And that's the perversion at the heart of this system. So there's really two perversions. One is it's the use of other people's money, not their own money, and they're actually using other people's money who mostly disagree with the agendas they're advancing. But the second perversion is the nature of the question. It's a question of the wrong kind, that they're using capital force to settle, when in a democratic society, at least, those are questions of a kind that we settle through a shared political process that we set into motion through a constitutional republic.
How did BlackRock come to be so dominant? How did they manage to leverage themselves into a position like this?
Yes, so it's a long story. I start to tell it in my first book that there's two halves. There's two halves to the story. One is the top-down cynical version. That's the version I told in Woke Inc., and that's half the story. The second of it relates to our culture and the cultural and generational moment we live in, because it takes two to tango. Consumers have to fall for it. What are the conditions that allow consumers to fall for it? That's the subject of my most recent book, Nation of Victims, which relates to our culture of our general populace that left our population vulnerable to the trick. But let me start with the first. I mean, on the realist side here, the top-down version of this, what happened was on the back of the 2008 financial crisis. And by the way, I lived this. I got my first job in New York City at a prominent hedge fund on the eve of the 2008 financial crisis. I had somewhat of a front row seat to this. What happened is that Wall Street and financial institutions and big banks, big business more broadly, but financial institutions in particular, went from being the heroes of modern capitalism to becoming the bad guys. Okay, Occupy Wall Street was knocking on Wall Street's doorstep. The new version of the barbarians were at the gate, and they were barricading the gate. They were barraging the gate. Okay, now there was a trick that came up right around the same time that the Occupy Wall Street movement was saying, you know what, we need to take money from those wealthy corporate fat cats and redistribute it to poor people to help poor people. There was the birth of this new strand on the left that started to say, well, it wasn't quite just economic injustice or just poverty that we need to address. It's also racial injustice and misogyny and bigotry and climate change and the racially disparate impact of climate change. That's actually the real problem. And that's when Wall Street woke up, where they said, wait a minute, this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity of a generation to say that, okay, we can do that. We'll talk about systemic racism if you stop talking about systemic financial risk. Right? We'll muse about the racially disparate impact of climate change after we fly in a private jet to Davos. We'll do that all day long. But we expect that the new left work with that old left and come to a bargain where you agree to look the other way and leave our game intact, as long as we use our game, our power, corporate power included, to advance some of the agendas that you all love. So it was this cynical arranged marriage between two bedfellows who didn't really love each other. It was closer to mutual prostitution than an arranged marriage. But the net result was the birth of this hybrid of state power and corporate power that together was more powerful than either one alone. That was whether you want to call it the woke industrial complex, the ESG industrial complex, that was what through kerosene.
Just call it fascism.
You could call it fascism.
Yeah, you could, because
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
what fascism means. Fascism means the
classical
union
definition.
of people at the top. Yeah.
The merger of state power and corporate power to advance what neither one could alone. This is modern fascism, no doubt about it. So anyway, that was the birth of that story top down. But as I said, it takes two to tango, right? I mean, it takes a culture to fall for this trick, right? To not be able to see through it. And so what's going on there? So that's what Nation of Victims is all about. It's the spread of this new apologist psychological attitude in our culture that left an entire general population that was vulnerable to be exploited by this trick. And at the end of the day, we also live in a moment where, my generation, Mikhaila, your generation, our generation probably and younger, millennials, Gen Z, whatever, we're so hungry for a cause and purpose and meaning and identity. We're on probably not you and I personally as much. I know I'm not, but on the receiving end of the largest intergenerational wealth transfer in human history. And, von Mises said this a century ago. Schumpeter said it at points along the way. capitalism creates the psychological need that anti-capitalism ultimately fills. And so this culture of accepting this self-criticism, those moral and psychological insecurities in a generation, that's part of what allowed the ESG movement to make for good business over the last 10 years, to aggregate funds, to say that you're going to invest not just for return, but also for virtue. And the two there's really three factors there. I mean, one is defanging the Occupy Wall Street old left. The second is a business opportunity, but third is a business opportunity created by a generation of consumers that were so psychologically hungry for purpose and meaning and identity and a cause that they fell for it, that together you got the new version of modern capitalism. What was supposed to be a challenge to the system became the system. And it's become, I think, the new form of fascist totalitarianism, effectuated, ironically, in the Trojan horse and in the veneer of the free market itself, which is actually pretty frightening.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. How much of this ESG, these mandates, are contributing to the energy crisis at the moment?
A lot is the answer to that question. So the number one sector palpably damaged by the demands of the ESG movement is no doubt U.S. energy, Western energy more broadly. Okay, and there's reasonable debate for that, because is it the policymakers that are responsible for it, or is the ESG movement? I think the answer is both, but I think the underappreciated role is the role that the private actors themselves have played. So I actually sent you guys may have seen it, I sent a public letter to the board of Chevron this week as a shareholder of Chevron, right? So my new firm launched a U.S. Energy Fund. Through that U.S. Energy Fund is a shareholder of Chevron. We sent a letter to the boards questioning certain of their behaviors that it's a good case study, but it's just an example of a broader trend of a company that did not want to adopt many of these toxic measures. How do we know that they didn't want to adopt them? Because when a Scope 3 emissions proposal, and I can tell you what that means, but when a toxic Scope 3 emissions proposal was imposed by shareholders on this company in 2021, the board of directors said, no, we recommend against this. It was proposed by a Dutch nonprofit founded by a former refrigerator salesman who wanted to fight climate change, who had, on the face of it, no interest in Chevron's business success, but put up a shareholder proposal that 15 years ago would have been appropriately ignored, but in 2021 earned the support of BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, giving it majority shareholder support. I use shareholder in air quotes because it's not their own money, it's the money of everyday citizens that are using to vote in favor of it. But at the end of the day, even though Chevron's board said, no, we don't want to adopt this, we recommend against it, it earned majority shareholder support with the aid of folks like Larry Fink's BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. And what does this kind of proposal call for? Let me just be specific about it. It's a little technical, but it's important to understand what a Scope 3 proposal calls for. It says an oil company like Chevron is responsible not just for reducing its own emissions, and not just reducing the emissions resulting from its own use of electricity and power in its own business. Those are Scope 1 and Scope 2 respectively. But Scope 3 emissions, which means that it has to reduce the emissions of its employees in their commuting costs to work, carbon costs, in their employee business travel, in their investments that they make, even in the use of their fuel by every customer in their supply chains. So if you get this straight,
Jesus.
I mean, this is staggering, right? So this is how they reach the private sector, the private companies too, because there's many private companies in the supply chain, even though Chevron's the public company. So I'm just going to make this really real for you, okay, here, just to make this crystal clear. This means that Chevron has to take responsibility for the emissions of a truck, an Amazon Prime truck that burns its fuel delivering food to someone's home without demanding that Amazon make a reciprocal commitment in return. That makes about as much business sense as McDonald's voluntarily committing to reducing the body weight of everyone who's ever consumed a Big Mac without asking the consumer to bear any responsibility in return. So the question I asked at the heart of the second section of my letter to Chevron this week was, why on earth is this possibly in the best business interests of Chevron?
This episode of the podcast was sponsored by Better Fed Beef, a cattle farming company that produces extremely consistent and tender beef. It's really the only beef I eat now. This is the type of company that's going to have major issues if ESGs aren't addressed. Better Fed produces high-quality certified Anya beef from cattle raised by local farming partners from the small-town Midwestern United States. The stuff's as tender as American Wagyu, and it's that tender, but at a fraction of the cost. They flash freeze their meat and ship their beef right to your home. I would and will never advertise a meat company I don't fully believe in. So I even had my producer after last episode, who's on the carnivore diet, say, okay, but do you actually endorse these guys? Because I have a code, MP, for a massive 25% off your first order. And I do. It's actually what I eat, and it's the best thing that I've found. And I've tried almost everything out there. I can basically eat, and I'm thankful for this, I can basically eat whatever I want to eat, and this is what I choose to eat. So that's convenient. They have an insane number of options to choose from, like the backyard barbecue box, tomahawk ribeyes, whole muscle ground beef, skirt steak ribs, and a lot more. Even if you're not on the lion diet or the carnivore diet, everyone can get healthier by eating more beef, and this stuff tastes great. You can also lose weight by eating more meat, which also helps you not fill up on processed foods. So it's a good idea all around. My listeners can take 25% off their first order by going to betterfedbeef.com and using promo code MP at checkout. Their website is betterfedbeef.com. Their motto is real beef from real families. Enjoy this episode. I hope you learned something about ESGs. It's messed up.
And I think that is the question at the heart of this debate. If it's in the right interest of society, great, let's debate it as a society through a democratic process where everyone's voice counts equally. But what you debate in the boardroom of Chevron, or the shareholders bring to the boardroom of Chevron, ought to be guided by a more narrow question. What is in the best long run? And this is to your second question, Dr. Peterson.
Yeah.
But your second question, what is in the long run best interest of Chevron? That's the scope of what ought to be debated in Chevron's boardroom. And I think that there haven't been other shareholder voices to the table. That's why I founded Strive. At the end of the day, we showed up as a shareholder, and Mike Wirth, the CEO, responded to me the very day I sent the letter. I was on CNBC, he was on Bloomberg. Great. Let's have this discussion out in the open. But Mikhaila, I think the positive part of this, just to end that rather pessimistic answer with a small note of optimism here, is that the employees, I've learned this pretty quickly, even in recent weeks. I mean, my company, we've engaged with over 10 US energy companies already since we launched our first fund that's a shareholder of these companies. What I've learned is the employees of US energy companies and even their CEOs and their boards, they're not the employees of Twitter. And I mean that in a good way. Where Elon Musk could buy Twitter, he's going to have a lot of trouble changing the behavior of 15,000 people who don't want to do the thing he actually wants them to do. In the US energy industry, it's almost the other way around, where most of these employees are quietly waiting to run in this new direction. They just need to be liberated from the handcuffs of the Blackrocks of the world who are imposing these ESG mandates.
Okay, so what exactly is Strive doing to help liberate these people?
Bringing a different shareholder voice to the boardroom. It's actually pretty simple. So just like BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard offer index funds, that's what Strive is in the business of offering as well. Ways for people to invest in different segments of the market. The first
tell people what an index fund is, so everybody's real clear about that, and what BlackRock offers. That's was part of my question about why they are in a position where they manage so much money. What is an index fund? Why would or should someone purchase one? And why yours, say, just out of curiosity, rather than say BlackRock's?
Yeah, well, I'll get to the part about Strive in a second, but actually you raise a good point. Let's actually go through a short history lesson of where this index fund concept came from and how it was that resulted in three institutions having $21 trillion of capital. It's a parallel to what happened in social media, which I think most people understand better. You have companies that gave away their products for free, right? You don't have to pay to use Facebook or Twitter or whatever, or Instagram. But it's not actually free. You only realize that after the companies build a network effect and realize that you traded off a lot of other contractual giveaways, your access to your data, your privacy, even what you see on the internet. Well, there was a similar game that resulted in a network effect in the asset management industry. And that was the rise of passive index funds, which said that, the old school mutual funds, which charged higher fees to have portfolio managers that were supposedly skilled at picking individual stocks to outperform the market. Mm-hmm. Jack Bogle, the founder of Vanguard, kind of said that, that was bunk. 99% of those people are monkeys throwing darts on a board. They're not outperforming. They're just charging you a high fee for it. So what we'll invent is a new industry that offers you really low fee exposure to the market, which isn't about outperforming the market. It's just about owning the market, but you get to own the market for a much lower fee than so-called actively managed funds like mutual funds.
Right, and there was no evidence that actively managed funds outperformed the market. From what I understand is that the typical active fund manager underperformed the market, which means they actually did worse than monkeys throwing darts at a dartboard.
Because
which
the
means
monkeys
that-
didn't charge the fees.
Right. Well, and also
Yeah.
the monkeys were sampling randomly.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I'd say the empirical data on this is cherry picked around all sides, but I think I'm very sympathetic to that claim. Having looked at a lot of the empirical data, what they'll say in response is, yeah, but if you take out the really bad active managers, then the ones who really know what they're doing actually outperform, which is of course a self-serving argument.
Yeah.
But it's a rich empirical debate. But anyway, I'm just giving the descriptive facts. I think that Jack Bogle made a compelling case to say that you can't know who the good ones are or the bad ones are. In fact, that may itself be random. So forget about it and just use low fee exposure, because even if they're just monkeys throwing a dart at the board and they're no better than owning the market, after you charge high fees, you might actually be worse off than just owning the market at a low fee. So this was a convincing proposition. I think it makes a lot of sense. But what happened was there was an invisible trade-off. The invisible trade-off was in social media, the giving up privacy, what you see on the internet and all of that, that good stuff. Here, the trade-off was they aggregated not just the capital in providing exposure to the market, but they also aggregated voting power to vote the shares of those everyday individuals who invest in the market. Now, that may not be a problem if they're just taking financial considerations into account into how they vote their shares. But starting in about 2018, and this was led by BlackRock, it's worth remembering how recent this really is in the voting problem. It's only started in about 2018 when Larry Fink said, all right, look, we can use this voting power to advance certain social agendas and burnish my own social standing and derive business benefits from that by doing so. That's really when this story took a dark turn. And the irony at the heart of this, if you think about that history lesson, is that the very people who told you that by admission, we're too dumb to pick stocks, we're not smart enough to pick stocks, suddenly thought they were sagacious enough to know how to design an entire social universe based on the social and environmental mandates for how companies are supposed to operate, right? So that's a bit of an irony if you think about it.
Yeah, you might say that, right? A bit of an irony is that you can't pick single stocks. You can't determine the probable course of the companies that you hypothetically have expertise in assessing, but you can actually pick with an unerring eye the direction of the entire planet, environmental and the economy, right?
Exactly.
Brilliant.
So I don't want monkeys throwing darts at a dartboard and picking stocks, but I definitely don't want those same monkeys throwing darts at the design of the social universe in Western society as we know it. Yet that's exactly what happened, because one became the vehicle to aggregate the capital to do the latter. So I've never really said it that way, but actually you're exactly right. More than a bit of an irony. And so anyway, that's the problem. So what am I doing? I'm writing about the problem. I'm speaking about it. I was a former CEO. I've seen this from the inside. At the end of the day, though, okay, you're only going to move the needle by shining a spotlight on the problem. Okay, I wrote a book last year. I'm writing this other book that's coming out in a month, and that's more about the culture, the revival of excellence over these apologist values. Okay, we're going to move the needle a little bit, but how about solving it? So I thought about, I thought about maybe is this a political problem that needs to be solved through state action? I grew disillusioned by that path for a range of reasons we can talk about. But then it became clear to me, look, if this is a problem that originated in the market, by golly, let's solve it through the market by actually bringing competition to the table. If this is an anti-competitive problem, and I can talk for a long time, if you guys are interested in this, about why I do think it's an anti-competitive problem. Well, at the end of the day, don't complain about it, solve it through competition. So that's what I did. So I founded Strive. It's a new asset management firm competing directly against BlackRock, starting by also launching index funds that say we're just not going to pick stocks. We're just going to offer exposure to the market, exposure to different sectors of the market, but crucially bring a different voice and vote to the table. And the voice and vote that Strive brings to the table is to mandate companies. We're not asking them. We're mandating them as a shareholder to focus exclusively on delivering excellent products and services to their customers over any other agenda, including social or political agendas, without regard to Larry Fink's or anyone else's social or environmental or climate change or racial equity goals. And that actually closes the loop. Dr. Peterson, you said something interesting about Milton Friedman. You had a critique of him, which was he doesn't say anything about the time horizon. I agree with you. My other critique of Milton Friedman is he doesn't say much about how it is a corporate board is supposed to go about this monumental task of maximizing shareholder value. That's irreducibly vague. In fact, that's part of the vagueness that allowed the ESG movement to then actually fill the void and say, no, we're actually concerned with long-run shareholder value. Well, what I want to do is make it really clear and say, focus on your products and services for your customers. That's how you maximize shareholder value. Anyway, that's the voice that strives.
Right. So you take responsibility for your particular level of interaction with the actual market. Is that people who run a big company, they have a domain of responsibility. It's not universal. Perhaps they should be acting universally in their private lives, but in their public and corporate life, they should be doing the right thing by their customers. And then we'd hope that the aggregate consequence of all the companies doing right by their customers would be everyone doing right in the broadest possible sense, in the absence of a centralized control system. And the problem with the centralized control system is you can't predict the outcome, which is exactly, as you pointed out, what the index fund managers were telling their customers to begin with.
Exactly. So in a certain sense, this business opportunity should not have existed. I never imagined I was going to start another business again. I thought I was done with that. But it was staggering to me that the investment firms that should have taken this on, and I don't mind. I'm beyond the stage where I need to play delicately here. So I'll just tell you guys, so before I started Strive, I had before I got started in knowing what the next step entailed, I was meeting with asset management CEOs across the country and was curious, almost encouraging them. This is a great business opportunity. You guys should pursue it. In some sense, my life would be easier if somebody else was doing this and I could, go back to hanging out with my family and writing books. But none of them wanted to do it. And so I actually met with the CEO of Invesco. I don't mind. Life's too short not to just be transparent about this stuff. That's another $1 trillion plus asset management firm. The CEO is a guy who I'm told was sympathetic to a lot of things that I was saying in Woke Inc. and elsewhere. And so we had lunch when I was in town in Atlanta. And privately, what does he tell me? Okay, well, at the end of the day, I think it's fair game. Let's just talk about this in the open. Privately, what does he tell me? He says he agrees with everything I'm saying. Okay, well, that's comforting, except for the fact that when you look publicly at the things he's saying afterwards, and even afterwards, I went to look at the things he's been saying. I promise you could not distinguish his quotes from Larry Fink's quotes about the ESG movement. Things like ESG is woven into everything we do. ESG is the way of the future. There is no investment process without ESG. Stuff like this coming out of his mouth, very similar to what Larry Fink has been saying. Now his reason for why is that large clients of his firm would not allow him to speak openly about his actual views. So in a certain sense, pension funds like CalPERS in the state of New York and otherwise, what they've done is they've gone to these asset managers and say that if you don't adopt a firm-wide commitment to the Climate Action 100 Network or to the Paris Climate Accords or to these ESG-linked agendas, then we're not going to do business with you. So what that creates is a difficult business decision for a new asset manager to make, which is to say that if I don't abide by these agendas, I'm going to lose business that I have today. Yes, there may be everyday citizens out there who want me to do something else, but they're not the ones exercising power in my boardroom or in my meetings. And so I'm just going to drag them along for the ride because that's the most profitable thing for me to do as a business. Well, you know what? The beautiful part then about starting as a new company is that you don't have those legacy commitments. And by the way, from Invesco to Blackrock, the biggest constituent that they don't like to talk about out loud is China. Those are some of their biggest growth opportunities is building asset management subsidiaries in China. And you will note, interestingly, that as these companies apply their ESG mandates to Western companies like Exxon and Chevron, they don't say a peep about ESG to PetroChina. And that's not by accident. China wants them to be behaving that way because that weakens the United States and strengthens China by advantage. I kid you not, PetroChina is literally picking up some of the very projects that firms like Exxon and Chevron are dropping. And the irony of this is that who owns approximately 5 or 6% of Exxon is a firm like BlackRock. You know who owns 5% of PetroChina?
It wouldn't be BlackRock.
Then BlackRock.
Yeah, there's a real
This
shock.
is staggering.
Yeah. So what do you think Fink is up to exactly? I mean, is there any of this that's genuine, or is it just like unbelievably large scale moral posturing? I mean, look, I feel some sympathy, because I can understand why people would want to devote their money towards hypothetically moral ventures. But I also understand that devoting your time and money to a moral venture is actually an unbelievably difficult thing to do. And if you think you can, what would you call, reduce your moral venture to a handful of ESG algorithms, you've got another think coming. And And especially when you see what's happening now too, because I'm in Europe at the moment. I'm in the UK,
Okay.
which I guess counts as Europe. And they're facing a vicious winter, and so are the Germans. And the Swiss announced yesterday or the day before that they would put people in prison for up to 3 years if they turned their thermostats above, I can't remember if it was 66 degrees, 66 degrees, 3 years in jail. And all of this is coming out of this idiot ESG and its subsidiary DEI, woke morality. And we're starting to put people in real danger here. So what's Fink up to exactly? Like, what's going on here as far as you're concerned?
Well, in Spain, actually, Congress said it was less than 81 degrees Fahrenheit is actually the legal threshold below which you can't set your thermostat in the summer in Spain.
Right, right.
It's you're right. It's a difficult thing to use your own money to advance a moral agenda in your own time and effort. But the easier thing to do is just to use someone else's money to do it instead. So that's what Larry Fink's up to. That's what he's up to.
Why is he doing this? Do you think he believes it? And
well,
if he does believe it, why?
Well,
it's so leftist. Why in the world would Larry Fink develop an affinity for a radical left policy?
Well, so there's a few things. There's a few things going on here. I may reflect his personal politics. I haven't met him yet, so I can't speak to what his personal politics are. From what I hear, that may reflect some of his own, perspectives. But I think there's a couple things going on here. One is a lot of these guys, right? I mean, I was in a room with Jamie Dimon a couple years ago. I'd say the same thing about him. They actually, a funny story with Jamie Dimon at that dinner, but I think this stands for Larry Fink too. He was asked by someone else at the dinner, hey Jamie, you're spouting, you're saying all of these great things. Wouldn't you want to be president of the United States ever? And he responded in candor. It was he presented as a joke, but it was funny, not because it was false, but because it was true. He said, well, of course I would want to be president. I just wouldn't want to ever run for president. Everyone in the room laughed. Everyone laughed because
oh yeah, that's real funny.
It was funny, not because it was so obviously false, but because it was so obviously true. So in a certain sense, for these guys, it's about exercising political power, right? The power hungry version of impulse in each of us as a human being. You're able to exercise that, discharge that, but without the messiness of actually going through the electoral process or the democratic process. That's messy. Why bother with that when I can exercise and flex my muscle as a social actor through the private sector itself? So I think that's part of the story. Part of the story is just
having $1 billion isn't enough.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I mean, the marginal utility of money goes down once you have goes down at every step, but definitely after you have over $1 billion, an extra unit of dollars or green piece of paper matter less than the ability to actually make your mark on the world, right? So I think that's a bit of what's going on here. But I think a bit of what's going on here is also the economic incentives, actually. So on the flip side, look, BlackRock has enjoyed a great relationship with the US government, including with this current administration, who is staffed by many alumni of BlackRock, who in return send a lot of their business back through BlackRock. And I think that if you want proof of this, if you look at the asymmetry of how they behave in China and how they behave in the United States, both are tailored to how they gain greater state favors in return. In China, they gain state favors by criticizing the United States and applying ESG in the US without applying those same standards in China. Great, they'll roll out the red carpet. BlackRock got to be the first foreign owner of an asset management business, whole owner of an asset management business in China. That's a great opportunity. You don't have to believe me. Larry Fink says it himself. It's one of their big growth opportunities. Conversely, in the United States, you get capital mandates from CalPERS in the state of New York and favorable treatment from the presidential administration that's in power. So in a certain sense, the incentives are set up for them to be able to do it. Now, that doesn't mean their clients benefit from it, because it's their clients' money who's being used to advance agendas that are destroying the very industries that they invest in certain cases, like the US energy industry. But the people who run that money gain a both economic and political advantage in so doing. So does that sound cynical? Yes, but sometimes the truth requires the cynicism that informs the real world.
It's impossible to be cynical enough about the situation we're in now, where the entire energy market in Europe and in other places around the world is now starting to fall apart for no other reason than that idiots broke it.
That's right. No doubt.
So how can you not be cynical about that? It's a crime not to be cynical about that.
I agree. I mean, you have your head in the sand and are contributing to the problem indirectly if you don't actually exhibit some agency in seeing the conspiracy that's hiding in plain sight. I mean, I now joke that ESG in Europe stands for export Soviet gas, because that's effectively the effect it's had on global energy markets. At the end of the day, for every unit of oil or gas production that's reduced in the United States, Canada, or Norway, which, by the way, are three of the cleanest places on the planet to produce oil or gas, in a global market, that's the slack is picked up by Russia and China. And by the way, methane leakage is far worse from oil production in places like Russia or China than it is in the US, Canada, or Norway. And even if you buy into the entire religion, lock, stock, and barrel, methane is 80 times worse for global climate change and global warming than carbon dioxide, yet somehow we indulge the virtue that we're helping the planet by shifting production to places like Russia and China. It's all about, and this is the problem.
Well, and freezing and starving poor people.
Yeah.
That's
I mean,
I'm just additional benefit.
I'm just pointing out the internal contradictions. I mean, there's a whole the whole cost that's actually imposing on the rest of the world. That we could go on for hours about that. But even on its own terms, it's debatable whether that's even achieving the said decarbonization agenda, because methane is a form of carbon too, that even on the terms of the greatest adherence to the climate religion is 80 times worse for global warming than carbon dioxide. So and by the way, the cherry on top, the biggest opponents to fossil fuels in the ESG movement are also the biggest opponents to nuclear energy, which, by the way, is supposedly the most carbon neutral form of large-scale energy production known to mankind. Vanguard's ESG funds, by rule, exclude nuclear energy companies, which show you what this debate is really about. To me, those two facts, right? The fact that it really wasn't about reducing carbon emissions so much as shifting those same carbon emissions to the east from the west. And then the second fact that actually, even as we're opposed to burning fossil fuels, we're also going to be opposed to the utilization of nuclear energy, reveals something really important about what's going on here. And the thing it reveals is that this actually wasn't about climate change at all. This wasn't about the energy debate at all. Yeah. This was about an attack on human flourishing, particularly human flourishing in the West, relative to other parts of the world. And the problem with nuclear energy, for example, is that it might actually solve the energy crisis, even the clean energy demand, too effectively. And the problem is, once you've solved the problem, then you lose the Trojan horse to pack in all of the other social agendas. Because wait a minute, how are we going to achieve...
You also lose the opportunity to exercise your unearned moral superiority.
Yeah, exactly.
And God only knows you don't want to give that up.
Exactly. And this is, as I say in my books, both of them, the problem with virtue signaling is at some point, the appearance of virtue becomes more important than being virtuous. And that's exactly what's happening here, where it's a form of dishonesty, where there were other agendas at work, the global equity agenda. How else would the rest of the world catch up with the West if it weren't for asymmetrically imposing fossil fuel caps on the West? Well, that's what explains the asymmetry in not applying the ESG standards to other parts of the world. It's also what explains the opposition of the ESG movement to nuclear energy, because both of those could actually solve the alleged energy-driven climate crisis without actually accomplishing the other social goals of addressing other global injustices instead. I'm not minimizing that conversation, but if we're going to have that conversation, let's have that debate in the open on its own terms, rather than using the Trojan horse of a climate religion to advance that agenda instead. And by the way, you're not even, as we talked about, even helping that third world. I mean, at the end of the day, 8 times more people today die of cold temperatures rather than warm temperatures. And the best answers to all temperature-related deaths is more plentiful and abundant access to global energy. You know where's net zero? Somalia.
Amen, man.
Okay. So at the end of the day, they can be net zero, but they have bigger problems and they're starving their people. So this is so anyway. I think there's so much going on here, but I think that we're very much on the same page on this, I would say.
Dad, can you talk? This is kind of off topic, but can you talk a little bit about what you told me a couple of weeks ago about ambassadors from Europe coming to Canada and America to ask for?
Oh, well,
energy?
it wasn't the ambassador. It was the Chancellor of Germany, who's a leftist. Right. Olaf Scholz came to Canada, cap in hand, about 3 weeks ago, and said to Trudeau, do you think you could open up the LNG pumps, so to speak? And Canada has massive reserves of natural gas, and natural gas is a very, very clean energy source, high density clean energy source. I mean, the Americans started fracking for natural gas in a big way back around the turn of the millennium. and they cut their carbon output. And this is relevant to Vivek's point about what are we trying to accomplish here? The death of Western civilization or saving the planet. The Americans cut their carbon output by 15% by turning to fracking. And Canada could have, over the last decade, invested heavily in liquid natural gas production and movement and then shipping. We have the technical ability to do it and to do it cleanly. And then we could have provided Europe with an alternative energy source that was clean and efficient. They're going to turn back to burning coal here right away. They're already doing that in Germany. And anyways, Olaf Scholz, who's one of Canada's great allies, let's remember that, came to Trudeau, one of his fellow left-wingers, and said, man, we could sure use some gas here since we're Putin's serf and slave because we set ourselves up to be that. And Trudeau said, well, we don't think we can make a business case for that. And the reason he couldn't make a business case for that is because his bloody, appalling administration has done everything they possibly could have to make it absolutely impossible for energy company to make a business case for it, because it's become so expensive and so difficult to do business in Canada on the energy front that no one's willing to risk the investment. You can't make this stuff up.
You really can't.
It's beyond comprehension. This is at the same prime minister who's spouting off at every moment his ritual adherence to the support for the brave people of Ukraine. But he's still willing to put all the power in the hands of Putin, who is much more masterful, as far as I can tell, at the moment, at the use of arbitrary power than any of the opponents he faces in the West. Means he's already put the screws to Europe, and just wait till the winter comes. If you think you've seen screws so far, man, we ain't seen nothing yet.
Right, you're so right about this. I mean, winter is coming to Europe, no doubt about it. And you know what? Putin's making a historical bet here. I mean, I obviously I can't get in his head, but if you're putting yourself in his shoes, what are you going to say? Russia has a long history of outlasting its European opponents through long, cold winters. Look at Napoleon, look at Hitler. They're not going to be able to muster the political power through this winter when they lack enough energy to actually heat their homes. And you got to think about, it's not just Trudeau. I mean, I want to, you look at this from the Canadian perspective. As a Canadian, I think you're spot on. I'll also make a very similar observation as American about President Biden, who, with one hand, is giving $45 billion in aid to Ukraine to fight against Putin. On the other hand, the number one lobby against the European ban on Russian oil imports was actually the US White House, was actually President Biden, which is in turn financing Putin's war machine that in turn allows him. The one thing that's gone well for Russia, of course, is its oil and gas sales going up since its invasion of Ukraine. So with one hand giving $45 billion to Ukraine, with the other hand lobbying against a policy that has the effect, in turn, of increasing Putin's cash machine to finance his war machine. So
yeah, well, let's not forget cozying up to the Iranians at the same point.
Yeah, of course.
Because that's a fun little side effect.
Yeah, a fun little side note that.
Oh yeah. That's just a trivial, and also alienating the Saudis at the same time while he's doing that.
So it's if this is bad economically, if this is bad geopolitically, if it's even, as I made an argument before, bad environmentally on the terms of the environmentalist movement's own terms, then why is it happening? And at the end of the day, it's that the small handful of actors who have benefited, both politically and economically, they wield so much aggregated capital, including capital aggregated from every citizens across Western nations. They are actually the ones who are able to influence all of these decisions because it's in their self-interest. That sounds conspiratorial, but it's hiding in plain sight. And this is not a left-wing or a right-wing debate as a consequence. I think this is a 1776 issue. This is a question about whether you believe in the distributed power, both distributed political power and distributed market power, that we set into motion in 1776, the year of the Declaration of Independence, the year of the Wealth of Nations. Both of those people forget were both in 1776. Is that what we believe? Or do we believe in the old world European model where a small group of enlightened elites decide the right answers to how society is to organize its affairs for the rest of society at large? I mean, that's a legitimate debate. It was a historical debate. We settled it in 1776 through a war. It reared its head again in World War I. That was what was at issue in both sides of the World War I battle. at the end of the day, that has now reared its head again in the 21st century version of this, in what's at stake in the ESG movement, is the debate between distributed power through a democracy, distributed power through actual decentralized free market capitalism, or the new version of monarchy. And this is not a left-wing actually agenda, it is a monarchical agenda that I think people, once they see what it is, hopefully can debate this issue in terms that transcend political partisanship.
That's the sort of thing that Russell Brand keeps objecting to, because in some sense, he's an objector on the left. And what he's fundamentally objecting to is monarchical pretensions on the part of gigantic corporations rather than gigantic government actors. But a common enemy, as you just pointed out, or a common threat, I would say, is unconstrained gigantism, period. It doesn't matter whether it's on the corporate front or the government front. And remember back in 2008, the mantra was too big to fail.
That's right.
Okay, how about this for a mantra? So big, you must certainly fail.
I like that, actually.
Yeah, absolutely,
I like
man.
that.
And it's relevant to this issue of the fundamental debate that you see going on here, is that, and it's relevant to this issue of so-called fascism that we talked about earlier. Too much centralized control constitutes a catastrophe in and of itself. It doesn't matter if it's corporate or governmental. It's right. The same problem. And the problem is the Tower of Babel problem, essentially, which is you have one centralized authority who has all the responsibility and all the power, and everyone else is turned into a voiceless peon. And that means the centralized authority turns into a tyrant, partly because they get dissociated from the populace, and all of the intermediary structures of responsibility that should be there as an antidote to that totalitarian structure are wiped out, are demolished. And then you have the moral hazard that all accrues benefit, at least in the short term, to the people who are wielding the power and accruing the moral virtue. It's utterly appalling.
It is appalling, but I think that I'm also just increasingly focused on how it is we're going to do something about this. And I know this is something that both of you think a lot about. I think about it. At the end of the day, you could think about breaking up that distributed power. I like breaking that up through market competition. It is wild to me. It is staggering to me that literally no one else has taken up the mantle of creating an affirmative alternative to ESG. I founded Strive earlier this year. Okay. I think others should be ashamed of the fact that within the first year, Strive is unambiguously the world's, I think, leading voice at offering an affirmative alternative to ESG in the marketplace.
How much, can you talk about how much capital you are now indirectly responsible for, and also what dangers you think your approach might produce? Because some of this was unintended consequence of index fund development, right? So what are there dangers in what you're doing that you see on the gigantism side, and how are you guys doing at Strive?
Well, so there's I mean, I was not without some reluctance that I started Strive, because I do worry about the bifurcation of an economy in a democratic society. I think the private sector needs to be a place that provides cohesion in an otherwise divided body politic. I mean, this is Tocqueville, the intermediating institutions. American capitalism is an apolitical intermediating institution. And so the last thing, and I'm very focused in the way we're building Strive to minimize the risk. It is a risk, but to minimize the risk that we actually contribute to that fracturing and the politicization of the private sector by affirmatively keeping our North Star as depoliticizing the private sector. But that won't be easy. So Strive is brand new. I mean, its first fund only launched on August 9th. And the thing that was staggering is within the first month, within the first 3 weeks, we exceeded $300 million in just that first fund, which makes it, I think I'm told, the fastest launching non-seeded ETF, exchange traded fund of the year, which for a newcomer, it turned a lot of heads you could look at the press around it in the financial press. It turned a lot of heads. People were shocked. What does that say? It says, and by the way, the average trade size in that first few weeks was less than $5,000. So the other funds that launched over $100 million in the first week, the average trade size was millions of dollars. In our first week, it was less than $5,000. In our first 3 weeks, I think we had over 400,000 visits to our website. I mean, I read many of these messages, were flooded by them. So this is a bottom-up demand of the everyday citizen who understands their money and their voice is being exploited by someone else today. I think that there's a potential tidal wave of everyday citizens who are hungry for a different alternative, but the system is so set up in an intermediated way that it's going to take a new market actor, and that's not easy. And that's the mountain we're climbing, taking a jackhammer to that system to ultimately break the dam to actually allow the voice of the everyday citizen to be heard over all of the intermediating financial institutions that actually serve as gatekeepers to advancing the voice and the interests of the ultimate capital owners, the everyday citizen whose money is being invested. Now, I think that part of this, I'm aiming to solve this, I hope, through the market. I hope to God there are other competitors like Strive that step up to the plate. And I think that will help solve the problem that I worry about, which is that there's one unilateral institution that represents this other alternative viewpoint to the otherwise codified ESG hegemony. I don't want hegemony in any direction. I want a diversity of viewpoints represented in a marketplace of ideas and represented in the marketplace of capital and products that's distributed. So I don't want Strive to ever become a $20 trillion financial institution. I think we should, by that point, have greater competition in the marketplace of capital and products and ideas that keeps the flow of capital competitive for the everyday citizens who are participants in that economy. And so do I worry a little bit about that? That's a high-class problem as a business that we'll turn to in the future. But I worry in the meantime about also politicizing this whole debate, which is unfortunately what the ESG movement has done. But even when you counter it through a movement of depoliticization, it's hard not to be seen as a politicized effort in its own right. And so that's what makes this a uniquely challenging thing to really do right, not just to go to the lowest hanging fruit and say that, well, we're going to create the conservative version of the liberal ESG movement. I think that would be the wrong way to do this, versus to say that the way we want to do this is to actually take a depoliticized approach that focuses exclusively on what companies should be doing, and to take those political questions, as important as they may be, and to have the humility to say that we don't deal with those questions. Those should be reserved to the political process. And that was part of why I wrote the book as well. So I mean, I'm releasing the book, this week, right? And at the end of the day, part of the book, what I hope to achieve through the book is it's going to take a citizenry who is no longer susceptible or vulnerable to the demands and to the siren song of the virtue signaling and the advertising through virtue that has empowered the ESG movement. And what I worry about is that we can live in this moment where we have this black hole of identity in an entire generation, an entire nation, and an entire Western civilization, that the kinds of things that used to fill those moral voids, whatever they may have been, right?
You mean like family?
Family. That was at the top of it. You took the words out of my mouth.
Example.
Family as an example. And we could have other examples. Hard work as an idea. People used to derive identity from hard work. Religion,
patriotism,
patriotism,
religion, community,
national identity.
all these subsidiary organizations, levels of social organization.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, you're going to intuit this even more deeply than I did in writing this book, just because it's where you spend your waking hours over decades of scholarship. But you're right about that. Whatever those may have been that filled that void of identity and meaning and purpose. When we've lost that, there's this black hole of a vacuum that then allows poison to fill the void. And so one of my goals with Nation of Victims was, look, far be it from me to have all the answers, but at least to start the conversation about offering one vision of what it means from an American context. What does it mean to be an American in 2022? If you ask most of America's citizenry, I don't believe they have a good answer to that question. I offer one answer to that question, which is part of what it means to be an American includes the reason why many immigrants, including my parents, travel across the world to be part of America, is to pursue excellence unapologetically. To say that the shared pursuit of excellence, of self-actualization, and to be free to do so in whatever way we as individuals and free agents determine is the right way for us to pursue excellence in our lives, to be able to do that, to be able to do it in an unrestricted way, and to be able to do it unapologetically, that is part of what it means to be American.
Well, I would put a twist on that. So I just did a seminar in Miami on the biblical story Exodus, and Exodus is the prime story that let's say people promoting freedom of all political stripes referred to when trying to foment transformation in the face of tyranny. And one of the things that God says to Moses when he's enjoining Moses to push back against the tyranny of the Pharaoh is, "Let my people go." And that's that call to the sort of freedom that you just described. But that's actually not what God says. And it's said 10 times, one for each plague. He says, "Let my people go so that they may serve me in the wilderness." And so it isn't freedom exactly, it's constrained freedom. And the reason I'm making this case is because the case you just made there for freedom versus, say, top-down tyranny can turn into kind of an atomistic Protestant liberalism where we're nothing but atomistic actors defining our identities subjectively. It's sort of, and so here's an alternative vision of freedom. It's like, well, you're free to vary and play as an individual, but that's within a relationship, within a committed long-term relationship, because that puts some boundaries on you. And then devoted towards families, and then devoted towards communities, and then devoted towards states and nations, and then maybe devoted to the international order. And you have to have fealty at all of those levels, and that actually constitutes your identity, right? So it's not just the freedom.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. And so you responded to the appropriately to the way I framed it in that 20-second rant in summary of the book. But in actuality, one of the arguments I also make, and this is synchronous with what you just said, is that actually virtue is not a product of capitalism. Actually, I think that virtue is a precondition for capitalism to deliver on its promise, right? And so I'll give you an example, and I laid this out in, now I'm losing track with which book it came up in, but across the two books. Facebook actually faced a lot of criticism. And I've been a public critic of a lot of the censorship on social media. So people called me when Facebook faced criticism for its knowledge that teen girls using Instagram suffered body image issues that were caused by the platform, and that its anger management, that people suffered anger issues when using its platform, and they knew about it and they didn't do anything about it. And they expected me to criticize Facebook since I'd criticized Facebook for its censorship practices. But my response is actually different. I actually said that, you know what? I'm not sure I want Facebook. In fact, I'm sure I don't want Mark Zuckerberg in charge of being responsible for cultivating the kind of self-confidence and identity and virtue in a teen girl that gives her the psychic security and fortitude to not be vulnerable to being picked out by an algorithm in the way that Instagram works. In fact, I think that's part of the problem, is that, again, we didn't cultivate enough of that psychic fortitude, that virtue, whatever you want to call it, in the offline world, that left them vulnerable to being algorithmically exploited in the online world. But the answer isn't to make Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey a modern rabbi or a modern day priest. It's to actually do the hard work in the offline world, even outside the sphere of the market, to get to the same place. And so one of the cases I make in The Nation of Victims, and I don't know if a lot of conservatives are going to love this, Dr. Peterson. I'm going to be really honest with you. I don't much care. I think that there's two components to this. I'm speaking from an American context, American identity. Part of it is responsive to the half of us, that the half of us internally, I mean, the half of me internally, that wants to be the individualist, the rugged individualist, pursuing my own dream as a free agent, expressed through free market capitalism. Okay, that's half of the story, the individualist. But if we're being honest with ourselves, each of us as citizens also hungers to be part of something that is greater than ourselves, a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. And that too is part of what it means in the American context to be an American. And in that is I think, the beautiful tension at the heart of Western identity, at the heart of American identity, the individual, the whole, individualism and unity. They sometimes run roughshod over one another. Capitalism and democracy, I think, are the expressions of each of those. And one of the things that I think the conservative movement gets wrong, so I would want to be the last person that was guilty of committing the same mistake, was talking disproportionately about the former, which is just the pursuit of freedom through the system of free market capitalism, something that we've lost and need to revive, no doubt. But without talking about the revival of a bad word I'm going to use here, but it's a word I think we need to at least need to talk about more, the revival of civic duty to a nation that also is part of what it means to be a citizen. And I think that the two actually go hand in hand, because part of the stakeholder capitalist siren song is to be the apologist for being the capitalist, pursuing your own self-interest. But that comes from the fact that you never were actually a fully formed citizen who had lived out his civic duty in the first place. So you have the psychic insecurity that gave you the muscle memory of neither pursuing self-interest nor pursuing sacrifice ever properly, because the two were always commingled. And what I think is we actually need to revive the muscle memory of doing each of those things unapologetically in our different capacities as both capitalists and as citizens, by separating those activities and those pursuits from one another. And one of the things I think the conservative movement, particularly in the United States, gets wrong is it's completely sacrificed and given up on this idea of civic duty as a constituent feature of citizenship itself. And the idea of being a citizen of a nation is part and parcel of what gives you the foundation to then be a self-interested capitalist in the sphere of the market, and part of what allows capitalism to then fulfill its promise in an otherwise democratic society, which is to say that, I often joke that, but it's not really a joke, but I do joke saying that everything that's ever wrong with capitalism could be explained by the fact that our wants do not fully match our needs. And that divergence in the delta between the two is what we might call virtue in the first place, which is why I come back to what I started with, which is virtue is a precondition for capitalism to deliver on its promise. So I don't know how much of that resonates with you or you agree with or not, but that's definitely a big part of the book.
Well, I think I'll add one thing to that, and then I'll turn the questions over to Mikhaila again. Look, if you're not a virtuous citizen and you're a capitalist, like a self-interested, hedonistic capitalist, free market, individualist, you're going to be guilty because you're not oriented in the proper direction, let's say towards the highest of all things. And the problem with being guilty is that when the mob comes for you and accuses you, you're going to be guilty. And then you're going to do foolish things like abide by ESG statutes, let's say, and try to backpedal because you're guilty for what you've done. And it is exactly as you said, because the sacred duties of citizenship and the identity that goes along with that, which is actually psychologically protective in the highest degree, that's been sacrificed. And part of what's happened too is now that's being replaced by this insistence that only subjectivity defines identity, which is an unbelievably immature and pathological insistence. And so that fractionates and alienates everyone on the basis of their subjectivity. And that also facilitates the transfer of responsibility and power to the people at the top of the towers of Babel. So revitalization of citizenship in its broadest sense, that's absolutely necessary.
And this is one of my failures in Woke Inc. It was one of my regrets in that last book is that I didn't do anything with this idea of citizenship. And that was the gaping hole that led me to write this new book. So that's at the heart of Nation of Victims, actually. And there's a chapter in the book called A Theory of Duty. It plays on the John Rawls trope of a theory of justice. I think that David Hume had a famous thought experiment about the missing shade of blue. He believed that he could infer from a spectrum of shades of blue, a shade of blue that was missing from that. He could tell you exactly how it looked without ever having seen it, but it's what he called his missing shade of blue. I call this the missing shade of red for the American conservative movement, is this theory of duty. And so if I had to pick up a chapter of the book that was the most important, it was the chapter entitled A Theory of Duty. And I think that was part of what I missed in even what was, in retrospect, a more myopic perspective that I brought to bear in Woke Inc. that I hope at least begins the project of filling out that vacuum in Nation of Victims.
You guys are talking about revitalization of citizenship, but what are examples of civic duties people should actually pursue?
Shall I start with that?
Please, yeah.
Okay, well, I think you can think about it hierarchically, and that's the most effective way to do it. You owe yourself, your extended self, you owe a duty, which means you have to act in a manner in the present that doesn't sacrifice your medium to long-term viability and well-being. And I think the voice of conscience and the voice of meaning are pointers to that. And so when your conscience calls you on your misbehavior, it's because you're subordinating your long-term sustainability and growth to the hedonistic and impulsive demands of the present. And so you're acting in a very immature way. You're not making the proper sacrifices, even in relation to yourself. And then you have to have someone along for the ride, someone that you commit to over the long run, a wife or a husband who you bind yourself together with and struggle through life with. And then that's a foundation for a family. And that family, the children in your family, they remind you. I just watched Bill Burr's new special. It was quite funny, very politically incorrect. And Bill Burr has a real temper and he doesn't control it well by his own admission. And he says his 2.5 to 4-year-old daughter, so over a 2-year span, has been a signal, what would you call it? Moderator of his temper, because when he gets upset, his daughter has learned to come and pat him on the shoulder and tell him that he's going off the handle and that he should be careful and that he doesn't have to be so upset. And your children do modify you if you set the circumstance up right to keep the harmonious balance of life going in your family, you have to modify your own stupidity, and that keeps you sane. And then you do that with your family in relationship to your local community, and then the state and the province, and then the national sphere and the business sphere and the sphere of your friends. And then you can think of mental health not as something that's subjectively defined or even subjectively experienced, but as the felt sense of the harmonious balance between all these different levels of identity stemming from you all the way out to, well, to the broadest possible sphere. And that is, as Vivek pointed out, that's something conservatives haven't figured out, is that you can sell to young people, and I've seen this in my lectures, you can sell people, young people, the idea of multidimensional social identity and responsibility as a solution to their problems of nihilism and meaninglessness. And it's the genuine solution. It's not an ideology or a Band-Aid solution. It's like, that's life, to do all those things at once properly. And that is it's a gaping hole in our culture that isn't being filled by much at the moment.
Okay, so would that be summed up in like actual actionable things people can do? Would that be summed up in figure out how to have a proper relationship and get married and ideally have kids?
Well, that's a
Begin
start.
with? Yeah.
Yeah, well,
That's
and
a
you
start,
have your
you know.
job, you have your friends, you have your civic duty, as Vivek points out. Join a political party, join a church. Your cynicism about those things, especially when you're young, doesn't justify your lack of participation. Of course, they're corrupt and blind, partly because no young people are in there working diligently to set them right. Now, I mean, young people have things to learn too, but they can at least be eyes for the blind.
Mhm.
So
I'm going to throw something out here, and I'm going to say that this is something that I'm not there on being fully committed to yet, but I'm a lot closer than I would have been 10 years ago. I have to admit that, or even 5 years ago, even 2 years ago. Mandatory military service. Mandatory military service. I struggle with that because of the aggregation of state power and what that means, but the cultivation of citizenship and co-equal citizenship is something that cannot be simply wished upon a society. It has to, as your capacity as a citizen has to be earned. And what I believe is, if we see ourselves as truly co-equal citizens, then we will stop obsessing over fetishizing the differences in the green pieces of paper or whatever other petty privileges are, the superficial privileges that now we obsess over correcting for. And those native psychological impulses, I think, are rendered silly by comparison to a deeper civic equality. And I think many conservatives will cringe at this idea. I would have cringed at this idea as recently as a few years ago. But I think that actually that's part of our path to the shared revival of excellence in individual self-actualization, is the insecurities that stop us and shackle us from being able to pursue our own vision of excellence and self-actualization as free agents in the world, are in part created by the psychological apologism, I forget the word you used, but the guilt, right?
Guilt,
that was created by the lack of civic equality in the first place. There may be some very pragmatic benefits to this in the West anyway. I mean, we can talk about the rising and I think potentially inevitable Thucydides trap-esque, destiny that I think we in the United States and Canada may face with the rise of China, and I think triggered by the invasion of Taiwan, which I think is upon us in the next couple of years, and the implications for the global semiconductor supply chain, to the way we even live our Western lifestyle, very much at stake for what happens there. In a realist sense of the world, this may not be an option anyway. But putting aside what for this conversation I'll call just a positive externality, I'm actually solving for a different internal goal of reviving the psychic and civic fortitude of an entire nation. In a certain sense, those aren't two different issues anyway. I think that our foreign policy and our ability to project strength abroad starts with our civic strength at home, but brings me back to an idea that I would not have even entertained as one that made it to the table of conversation 2 years ago, to something that I'm actually growing increasingly sympathetic to in the American context, maybe in the Canadian context of like in an Israeli sense of the model, a mandatory civic service through military. It doesn't have to be combative military, but in some sense of actually serving the national security of the United States or of Canada, of being a citizen of a nation state, like it is to be a citizen of Israel today, part of what it entails is acting out that civic duty over a 1 or 2 year period, or period that's distributed over the course of a decade. That's the implementation question, but the idea itself, I'd really be curious for your reaction to that, because I'm still thinking through this one.
I'd be inclined to make that an invitation rather than a necessity, and that I think the right way to do that perhaps is to do the sort of thing that we're doing in this conversation, which is to make a case that without pronounced civic engagement and the sacrifice of a narrow hedonism that necessitates, we're all going to be not only in trouble socially, but we're also going to be in trouble individually. That you have to pick something above yourself to serve, or you'll be miserable and unhappy. But I think to the degree that you do that voluntarily, because voluntary participation is so important psychologically as well. And I think you can do that by telling people the right compelling story.
And paying people.
So you're optimistic.
Well,
that's an optimistic view. That's an optimistic view.
Well, it isn't. It isn't. It's not that easy to formulate the story properly, right? That's the trick. And one of the things I have learned on my lecture tour, hundreds of times now, I would say, is that it's possible to make a case for the redeeming quality of responsibility and maturity. It's possible to make a case that people really respond to if you can do it clearly and lucidly enough. And to say to people, look, you might think of these external games, these external constraints as nothing but restraints on your hedonistic freedom. Why should I get married, when I could have my choice of women? It's like, well, marriage in some sense is a constraint, but in another sense, it's a game and a protective container and a precondition for your life. And you do give something up by deciding to play one game rather than another, let's say, but you don't, not nearly as much as you give up by not being able or willing to play any games whatsoever, which
Can I stay on that analogy for a second? Because I think it's so interesting to the national case, which we'll come back to right after that. But so then we get into an interesting discussion about, do you think that, let's take the Eastern model, take my family's context, or historical context of my parents, for example, in India or whatever, achieving that benefit, but somewhat through mandate, right? Is the arranged marriage model, certainly my grandparents' generation, the arranged marriage model, that you didn't really have a choice, but the society was set up to give you that binding constraint, but not even one that you volunteered into. My model of it was actually volunteering into the same model in the life that I live. How much of the benefit you derive from that constraint, the psychic vacuum that it fills, is the choice that you make into being bound versus how much of it is just from the experience of actually having it be so?
Look, that's a really good question. One of the things we do know psychophysiologically, let's say, is that if you present people with a stressor of a certain magnitude, so imagine it's an occurrence that would require a certain amount of time and energy and resources to overcome. If you present them with that stressor arbitrarily, you have to do this, or you bring them on board so they can choose to do it voluntarily, the pattern of psychophysiological response is completely different. In the first situation, it's a stress response, and it tends to be physiologically damaging, especially if it's exceptional. In the second case, it tends to be beneficial. And so I would say an optimized social accord is predicated on voluntary agreement. Now, you might say, well, it's impossible always to negotiate towards an optimized solution. And I would say, well, that seems to be the case with criminals, for example. And so maybe there are circumstances under which compulsion is required. But, part of what we're arguing against here on the ESG front, in some sense, is
compulsion.
Yeah.
Well, is to remove that compulsion.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I think, and you're offering people with Strive, you're offering them opportunity to choose a different path, and you have a powerful narrative associated with that. And I would say that's optimal if you can do it. Now, that doesn't make it easy.
Yeah, I would identify a third space, actually. The way I'm thinking, I'm still thinking about this in the analogy between marriage and the Eastern arranged marriage context versus the Western chosen marriage model, and its implications for the national service and the military service discussion we were just having. But I wonder if there's a space for a third category right? You talked about the model of sort of forced adoption of behavior versus choice, and the benefits, even psychological benefits associated with actually choice being an important component to it.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder about a third space, and this is actually closer to the arranged marriage model, right? No one was using police force or government backstop military force to say, doggone it, you two are going to marry each other. But it was woven into the social fabric so much so as to become the norm, right? Mm-hmm. This is the societal norm and expectation that this is the binding constraint that you will adopt, not having choice of women, but be bound to this household and to derive that benefit, not backstopped by the police state at gunpoint. But there's an element of it that's different than just voluntarily being persuaded by the arguments either.
Well,
right?
Look, one of the things man, people want norms. Let's look at the situation with teenagers.
Yep.
We think of teenagers as rebellious. Well, they're not rebellious. They're so peer-oriented, it's beyond comprehension.
They're hungry for the norm.
They're rebellious against their parents because they're trying to move away from dependence into the broader world, but they're starving for norms. And every teenager is dying to fit in. And I mean that literally. If you don't fit in, you're going to want to die as a teenager. It is no joke. And so the notion that there should be norms and ideals for people to follow that are part and parcel of the cultural structure is actually the definition of a cultural structure. And I think it is a third way between, it's tradition versus force. And you might say, well, tradition, maybe you're a follower of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and you say, well, people are naturally good, except insofar as society warps them. It's like, well, that's half the story. Society can warp you to some degree, but it also shapes and molds and guides you and provides you with the necessary rules of playable games. And that's not well explained to young people anymore at all. That really they don't want absolute freedom. They want the freedom to choose a game and then abide by the rules of the game. And tradition offers them a variety of time-tested and sustainable games.
Dad, going back to you talking about how you have to basically choose your hardship, otherwise it's traumatizing, right? You can't be forced into it. Is there any literature talking about whether or not something that is maybe a little bit harder than you would choose would still be maybe even more beneficial to you? Like, I know some of the hardships I've been through that I would have avoided at the time, I look back on and think, oh no, I wouldn't go back and change it. But at the time, there's no way in hell I would have chosen that route.
Yeah.
Not that you want that implemented by the government.
We're talking about optimality here. You know, your mother and I were talking about relationships the other night in response to some dancing we've been doing. We've been experimenting with this new dance where we push on each other's hands and play, right? And it's quite interesting because you can balance against each other extremely precisely. And so it's a very interesting way of dancing. I learned it from a woman in Nashville when I was down there. She volunteered to give me a dance lesson. In any case, part of what you're doing in a relationship is providing each other with optimal resistance, right? And you do that in a competition, in a game as well. You want to be playing against someone who's about as good as you. And then that pushes you to the limit. And I would say, Mikhaila, that the marker for being pushed to the optimal limit is that you're playing intensely. And then if it exceeds that, then it starts to get risky. Now, you might say, well, that's not as risky as never being challenged. And I think that's true because never being challenged is the pathology of hyperdependence. But if you exceed your limits and it starts to become not fun, part of that's a marker that you're exceeding your psychophysiological capacity to master the new challenge at the rate at which it's occurring. Now, you still might be able to do that, but generally, if someone goes through a period of time that's extremely difficult, then it takes them quite a long time to recover. Now, they might be better off afterward, but they still pay a price for it. If it's optimal, it's play.
The resistance, what was the word you used there? I really liked it. You said it was
optimal resistance.
Optimal resistance.
The word helpmeet, which is what God calls Eve when he makes her for Adam, means in the Hebrew, it means beneficial adversary. It means
Really?
partner. Yeah, it means partner of optimal resistance. And that's actually a play partner, because a play partner is an adversary of optimal resistance. That's like a definition of what constitutes play. And so I would say, I'm trying to work this out too, trying to solve some of the problems that you're addressing, is like, what's the antithesis of power and compulsion? Like specifically, what's the antithesis? And the antithesis to the spirit of power and compulsion is the spirit of play.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we know that
And
in the animal literature as well.
And it's not freedom without that resistance, which is exactly the libertarian siren song. So
yeah,
this
it's
is
also not freedom. It's also not freedom without structure, because if you're going to play,
that's right.
It's got to be a game.
The structure is part of what provides the optimal resistance, right? That's what introduces the play. And so I love this analogy. I mean, it really speaks to me, you know, in sort of my marriage. That I think describes out why we work.
Yeah.
But
well, Vivek, it's not that the rules are the optimal resistance. The rules provide the precondition for the joint engagement in optimal resistance.
Sure. Understood.
Right?
Understood.
Okay,
Creates the conditions for play.
Well, right. Because if you're both playing basketball, you can hone your basketball skills.
Totally.
Right, so
So what I'm interested in is how can we, or if at all should we, extend that to the relationship between citizens in a co-equal relationship with one another, and the role of the nation state, or even the relationship between the citizen and the nation.
Well, there's a biblical injunction, right, that you can't enter the kingdom of heaven until you become like little children. And that's a very peculiar injunction. But a huge part of what that means, and this isn't all it means, but a huge part of what that means is that if you're an optimized adult, you rediscover the spirit of play in everything you do. And then you invite people along for the game. You know that as a businessman, to the degree that you've been a successful businessman, you tell me if this is wrong. If you're selling to someone, you don't force or pressure them into it. What you do is you go say, look, here's a bunch of things I'm doing, and I think they have value. And there's some things you're doing that seem to have value. And we could jointly bring our abilities together, and we could do something even better. And then they say, I'd be thrilled to do that. And then your interests are aligned, and away you go. And, cynics will say, that isn't how business works. And I would say, well, you go try to run a successful business, and you'll find out pretty damn soon that that's how it works when it's working.
Yeah, no doubt about it. No, I will second that right away. But what is that? What are the implications of that for the nation state discussion, though?
Well, I think you build that spirit of play everywhere that you can around you, and you practice that with your wife, and you practice that with your kids. And then maybe, part of what we're doing in this conversation is playing, right? We're here by our own voluntary will, and you have some things to say, and Mikhaila has some things to say, and we're pushing back and forth to see if we can optimize our conceptions. And we want to be doing that all the time, everywhere, with everything we do. Now, that's a very hard thing to manage, especially if you're trying to deal with people who don't know how to play, and criminals might be the most classic example of that. Many criminals, and this is straight from the clinical literature, of a very large proportion of career criminals are kids who did not learn to play properly between the ages of 2 and 4. It's a well-documented clinical literature. So then they can't play, and they don't know how to play with others. So they enforce their narrow and selfish, hedonistic, and impulsive games on others using compulsion. And then they're not popular. No one wants to be around them. And then they get resentful and bitter, and that makes them even more criminal. It's a catastrophe. They don't know how to play. So, and some people are much harder to play with than others. And that's a common problem. But still, that's still what we should be aiming for.
Do you think as a country or as a people that are kind of bound together, people need to have some sort of common enemy, which it's kind of a side note to the whole playing thing. But I mean, we seem to, as a society, be saying, okay, the common enemy maybe right now are racists or it's climate change. But you were talking about how people should potentially have mandatory, be in the army, mandatory.
Mikhaila, that's what Satan is for.
Yeah, but that might be a little bit too, that's a kind of
Demanding.
difficult to comprehend for
Well,
a lot of people.
Yeah, that's partly because we lack a reasonable religious education. But the idea, look, it's clearly the case that people can unite against a common enemy. The problem is you get the enemy wrong.
Yeah.
Then you demonize the wrong people, or you demonize people, period. The Judeo-Christian presumption, let's say, is that you identify that enemy in your own heart and you try to constrain it there. And then that does motivate you, right? Because it is motivating to work against what's terrible as well as to work towards what's good. But if you locate it inside, then you don't end up with pitchforks and
like
torches,
that.
Mobbing. Yeah, well, that's the plan.
That's cool.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The difficult question is how to actualize this vision amongst a populace that, maybe through no fault of their own as individuals, but because of the structures we've created, has very little interest or ability to engage in that type of play with one another.
I think the interest is there. Look what's happening with your company. You said most of the people who are investing are small investors.
That's right.
So you've offered them a better game. I wouldn't underestimate the hunger for this at all. I mean, I see it all the time as I'm touring. The reason
I think the hunger is deep as long as people are able to recognize it and show up. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, it's not easy for people to articulate these sorts of things, and they have a hunger and there's a desire, say, to adopt responsibility. That's definitely true. But the coherent narrative that would entice them towards doing that voluntarily in the absence of social norms has been lacking because we haven't been conscious enough to formulate it. But certainly in your books, you're trying to formulate it. You're trying to formulate it consciously. And you decided to take it upon yourself to produce this company. And and this is a game. It's a game. It's like, would you want to support ESG with your money? Or do you want to wake up and see what's going on and try this alternative route? And so that's what you're doing. And it looks to me like you're doing it in a very positive manner. So even in your books, your books are diagnostic, but they're not demonizing, you try to point out where the problems might be, but you're not trying to foist it off on someone else. And you are making a very strong case in what you're doing, I would say, in your writing, but also on the business front for the adoption of something like localized, non-Tower of Babel adoption of responsibility, financially and ethically. And that's a marketable story, man, in the highest sense.
Well, thank you for saying that. I mean, that's what I'm hopeful that will get us there, or at least get us enough of the way there.
It's the only thing that could get us there. That doesn't mean it will, because the alternatives are something like tyranny and slavery. The alternative to play is tyranny and slavery. Mm-hmm. That's the alternative.
Freezing, maybe.
Well, freezing in the dark, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Vivek, what could the average person who's listening do to try and go against these ESGs? What can they do with Strive?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that at a higher level, putting Strive even to one side, I can come back to that. Look, when you feel like you're the only person who's in a room, whatever that room may be, who believes what you do, I think you have a civic obligation to speak up and express yourself. And I think what you'll find is that when you do it, you probably weren't the only person in that room who believed what you did. And so what is Strive doing? Strive's just providing a vehicle for people to be able to speak, but without having to take the same level of risk that they might by doing that at a meeting at work or at a board meeting or at a place where they may actually take risk of putting food on the dinner table. One of the beauties of buying an exchange traded fund on the New York Stock Exchange is that it's anonymous, but you're able to speak. At the end of the day, with the dollars you invest, you're actually speaking to corporate management teams, to boards, as an owner, telling them how you would like to see them behave.
Yeah, you've also put your money where your mouth is, and
exactly.
There's some real moral virtue in that. That's not virtue signaling. That's a bet. That's a sacrifice of value. It's the real thing. And so
it's the real thing.
One of the things I love about what you're doing.
In speaking, and Dr. Peterson, I think one of the things that struck me is this is from the stories of people who have, even in recent weeks, come out of the woodworks and really shared their experience of why they're drawn to this, is that if they said that at work, they may not be able to have certainty they're going to get that promotion or even keep their job or put food on the dinner table. But to be able to say it and to fully express themselves with their hard-earned dollars and hard-earned investment dollars and savings, to be able to say that, you know what, I'm going to unapologetically express myself. That's an intermediate way of being able to speak that hopefully gets people in our culture and our cultural norms to a place where they don't just have to do it through anonymous capital investment where, thankfully I don't have to worry about putting food on the dinner table. So I'm speaking on behalf of everyone who puts their money into Strive or Strive's funds. Great, but gets us culturally to a place where we won't need that anonymized intermediary vehicle either. We're able to do it in other spheres of our lives as well by normalizing it, right? To think about the use of norms and the way in which Strive, I hope what we're doing is then changing norms. And so what can the everyday citizen do? Well, look, part of the point of launching exchange traded funds is that those are democratized. Those are accessible to everyday citizens, unlike hedge funds or private equity vehicles that, because of, I think, misguided laws, limit the accessibility of that to the everyday citizen. Part of the reason I didn't want to just start some sort of alternative hedge fund or private equity vehicle, I mean, I was in the world of hedge funds before, was to make this a vehicle where the everyday citizen could actually speak on their convictions and to be able to do so with their own money and therefore the optimal authority that they bring to the boardroom or to the capital markets. That's part of what I wanted to create. I hope the everyday citizen is able to participate in that in whatever way makes sense for them. We launched our first exchange traded fund for the US energy sector in August. That was a very simple message contained in the ticker. It was DRLL, drill was the ticker of that fund. But there will be more of these funds coming in the future. So that's what Strive is bringing to the table. But Mikhaila, I just think that's a subset of a broader, I think obligation, civic obligation that any citizen has today, now more than ever, to say that when you find yourself surrounded in a room or in a meeting or in a culture where you believe you're the only one who has to say what you have to say, go ahead and speak up and say it. And I think that in the same way that fear has been infectious over the last decade of our cultural evolution, I think courage can be infectious over the next decade as well. And I'm really hopeful that, not only Strive, but hopefully other actors and institutions step up to the plate to create the conditions for that revival of courage in our discourse.
Well, I think psychologically that your solution is a very good one, because part of the problem with expecting people to speak up is that they're caught in a nexus of competing responsibilities.
Yeah.
So, for example, my clients, before my clinical practice precipitously collapsed because of the sorts of things that we're talking about, in no small part, I had many clients who were being bullied by activist types who were virtue signaling and bullying them at great personal expense. And many of them were loath to speak up because they were afraid they would lose their job or lose a promotion, and they had a family dependent on them. And so it wasn't exactly that they were cowardly, it was that they didn't want to sacrifice one set of virtues for another. And what I would do with those people is come up with a very detailed medium to long-term strategy to put them on firmer ground financially and practically, so that they could conceivably take the risk of speaking up without sacrificing their responsibility to the people around them. And you've done that in some sense with this fund, because you enable people to make a bet with something that's valuable, which is a cost and a risk and a real one, without simultaneously exposing them to the high probability that their financial viability will be compromised in the future. And so I think it's a lovely example of a very intelligent partial solution. And that's what we want, right? A plethora of optional partial solutions.
Yes, there's no such thing as a singular solution. This is at best a partial solution, but I hope a partial solution.
Yeah,
and a plethora of partial solutions might be our best hope of getting to some of the places we've discussed, we've addressed in this discussion. And
yeah, well, that's what you sort of believe if you're a free market person. It's like, well, what do we want? A plethora of possible solutions. That's
exactly
what we want. One of them might work.
Exactly.
And that shifts with time too.
So for my part, I'll write a couple of books and start a company. I hope somebody else chooses to make their contributions in in a different way. So well said. Thank you, Mikhaila. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for coming on. And I will link Strive and I will link both of your books in the show notes or the description if anyone's interested in checking them out. And then do you have websites or social media people can follow?
Yeah, strive.com is where Strive is, so that's pretty easy. My one social media that I use relatively actively is on Twitter. I'm at Vivek G. Ramaswamy. VivekRamaswamy.com is a website, but it's not there's not too many Vivek Ramaswamys floating around, so I won't be hard to find. But I'd love to engage in this play that both of you talked about with anyone who reads the works that I put out, anyone who's a client of Strive or wants to be a client of Strive. This is part of a broader play between co-equal citizens. And so, let's have at it. Please find me.